This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, Bruchim Abom, welcome everyone. Tonight's Shiur, we're going to go on an expedition. So you have to put on your gear. You got to gear up for a very interesting opportunity. This is not for the faint-hearted. If you're used to staying at home, lying on your couch, living a boring life, this Shiur is not for you. You have to be ready have a sense of adventure, to be able to really appreciate what we're about to do. At the end of this week's Parsha, the Rebbe gives Klal Yisrael the Mitzvah of Tzitzis. The Pasuk says, Daber Bnei Yisrael, V'amart Aleim, V'yasu Lohem Tzitzis, Al Kanfei V'gdeihem L'Doyroisam, V'nasenu Al Tzitzis HaKanaf, T'Sil Techeles. Now we know, everybody, of course, wears tzitzis. The mitzvah of tzitzis is that if you're wearing a four-cornered garment, one is required to put tzitzis on it, but beyond that, Rav Moshe writes, Minhag Yisrael is to go out of one's way to make sure that during the day, one is always wearing a four-cornered garment, and even at night, the custom is we wear our tzitzis until we go to sleep. This is not just a nice practice, this is Minhag Yisrael, and it's an accepted minhag Yisrael, and therefore it has a level of obligation. However, to our great dismay, there is a part of the mitzvah that we no longer have, and that we have not had for many hundreds of years, and that is the aspect of Techeles. We know the mitzvah of tzitzis consists of two parts. You have the white strings, but the Torah tells us in this week's Parsha, B'nosnu al tzitzis hakanaf pesil Techeles. You also have to have the blue strings. And already, unfortunately, for many hundreds of years, just like we don't have a Beis HaMikdash, and we don't have a Kohen Gadol, and we don't have the Urim and Tumim, and we don't have the Aron, and we don't have all the miracles, and we don't have Nevi'im, by the same way went the Techeles wall. And one of the first people to create a big movement, and a stir, and an interest, and an excitement, to actively pursue, and to try to find Techeles, was a great man by the name of Reb Gershon Chanoich Leiner, the Rebbe of Radziner, the Radziner Rebbe. And the Radziner Rebbe, I don't know if he would have been able to be a Rebbe today in 2014, but he was an extremely colorful personality. He's not the way you picture a regular Rebbe. First of all, this man was a brilliant scholar. He was expert in many disciplines. He was well versed in all the sciences. He spoke many, many languages. Aside from that, he took upon himself the great task. We know there is no Gemara on Seder Taharos. The Radziner Rebbe decided to take upon himself to collect all of Yerushalmi, Sifra, Safri, Mechilta, Medrash, Zohar, Tosefta, and any authentic source of Torah Shabbat Peh, and he wrote Gemara on Seder Taharos. Can you imagine such a thing? He wrote Gemara on the Seder Taharos. On the right-hand side, he wrote a very concise Perush, which would have been like Rashi on Seder Taharos. And on the left-hand side, he wrote a very lengthy commentary, which would have been like Tosfos on Seder Taharos. This was a breakthrough work, an incredible work, which was immediately challenged by many Talmidei Chachamim, not because they felt he was not worthy to write this, but because it was so amazing and such a good replica of the Gemara, they were afraid that people may mistakenly think it's Shas. So the Beis Din in Vilna, led by Rebbe Tzalel HaKohen, who in many letters had the greatest respect for the Radziner Rebbe, the Baalei Yom Tif, and a third member of the Beis Din of Vilna, said this work was not permitted, was banned. Who came to the defense of the Sefer Seder Taharos? The Malbim. The Malbim said, we never had a Talmid Chacham like this. You can't challenge it because it's too authentic. The Malbim said, we accept this work. Reb Yitzchak Elchanan Spector said, we accept it. Reb Yeshua Melekutna said, we accept it. And it was accepted. It was accepted. Can you imagine? By the way, we quoted it on the Shiur about the Goyim. Okay? Right? So, this is a man we're talking about, a brilliant scholar. And he, in the year 1887, he decided to try to find authentic Techeles. We all know that Techeles is produced from a aquatic creature called chilazon. And in 1887, the Radziner Rebbe penned a work called Sefune Temunei Chayil. Have it right over here. Baruch Hashem, I happened to get it a few months ago. Sefune Temunei Chayil, which he wrote in 1887. And he writes that to our utter dismay, we no longer are able to fulfill the mitzvah of tzitzis properly. And now we know tzitzis is a tremendous shmira. Chazal say anyone who has talis, tefillin, and mezuzah is completely protected from the Yetzer Hara. Chazal say further, many instances of people who were about to sin and they were whacked in the face with their tzitzis. Says Radziner Rebbe, it wasn't the white strings, it was the blue strings. And therefore, it is such a tragedy, unfortunately, that we no longer are able to have Techeles. He says, it is not unusual that we don't have Techeles, because there are many things we don't have because of the Galus. However, he writes in his introduction, if you look at number 2 in the second paragraph, in the bold letters, Achin vadai roi v'nachain v'chol dar v'dar. It is certainly fitting in every generation. L'chol mi asher yiras Hashem naga b'libay. If the fear of God strikes your heart, you are obligated lehisboinen v'lasam leiv lechapes an makom she'adam agas. You are obligated to search for Techeles. You're Jewish, you had bris milah, God told you to wear Techeles, you gotta find it. You gotta do what you gotta do. Go to Coney Island, go to the aquarium, and look for Techeles. Put on your scuba gear, go snorkeling, and find the Techeles. Now, you don't have to spend more than a fifth of your money. But if you're making $100,000 a year, you need to spend $20,000 going snorkeling, looking for the Techeles. This is our obligation. Ula yizakeo Hashem liyos mimazake harabim. Because if you find it, who knows, maybe you'll be the guy who brings back and restores the Mitzvah of Techeles. But we never heard for hundreds of years any Gedolei Yisrael going on expeditions and searching the ocean floors for Techeles? Says the Radziner Rebbe, that's why I wrote this volume of hundreds of pages to explain why today we are obligated to go out and find and seek out the chilazon and restore the mitzvah of Techeles. And after writing many, many pages, the Radziner Rebbe concludes the Sefer Sefune Temunei Chayil. If you look at number 3, he says, I got it. I feel that I have successfully identified the chilazon. And I discussed it with many Talmidei Chachamim. By the way, he sent letters to Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector. And what did Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan Spector say back? Nothing. Shtika kahayda, he took it as. He said he was maida to me. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan did not respond. And he spoke it over with many Gedolei Yisrael. And therefore he believes it is obligatory on every Jew to go out and search for the chilazon. And listen to what he says. On the third line in the second column. V'gam anoichi ba'anyi hachiloisi ba. And even I, in my impoverished state, I began to search. V'shilachti l'glilos Yam HaTichon. I sent to the islands, the provinces of the Yam HaTichon. What's the Yam HaTichon? The Mediterranean Sea. And I got my hands on a chilazon. They shipped it UPS, overnight delivery. And, in the morning he probably was wondering, what's that smell at his front door? And he opens up the box, and there in the box, lo and behold, something that has not been seen in nearly 1,500 years, the chilazon. Says the Radziner Rebbe, and what is the name of this chilazon? In German it's called tintfish. Called a tintfish. In English, by the way, it's called a cuttlefish. We'll see. How many species of cuttlefish are there? 19. Says the Radziner Rebbe, I narrowed it down to 19 species. And I am sure, he says, of these 19 species, one of them is the genuine, authentic chilazon. And therefore, I took out the ink of this species, and it was black like ink, but I was not able to extract the blue color. Says the Radziner Rebbe, you know why? Because when it came to my front door, it was dead like a doorknob. If I ever get my hands on a living chilazon, he says, if Rebbe Shem gives me siyata d'shmaya to travel to the Mediterranean Sea, now think about this. The Radziner Rebbe is a Hasidic Shia living in Poland. And he's saying, if God gives him the ability to travel to the Mediterranean Sea, that was a chalam that would never happen. Yet,
which year is this?
This is the year 1887 he's writing this. Okay? On the 11th day of Cheshvan, on a Tuesday, Parshas Vayera. Okay? On that day, these words are being written. And he says, look, the Rebbe was mazaka me to do things nobody ever did before. I wrote a Gemara on Seder Taros. Just like God has given me the zchus to write Gemara on Taros, please God give me the zchus to travel to the Mediterranean so I could lay my bare hands on the chilazon and extract the dye while this cuttlefish is still alive. Now, by the way, a cuttlefish is not your ordinary fish. Cuttlefish is a squid. It's tremendous. It has many tentacles that stick out of its head, and you do not want to get in its way. Because if it grabs you, you're not going to be necessarily in good shape. Nothing to do with the fact that he may squirt his ink at you. This cuttlefish is a powerful monster. Right? Yeah, you don't want to cuddle with the cuttlefish. Thank you. Okay, so... No, we're not up to there. Right now we're in 1887. 2014 I'm not up to. I'm up to 1887. So, that is the dream of the Radziner Rebbe. After writing Seder Taros, he would like to travel to the Mediterranean. Now, Rabbi Glatstein, what the first thing we have to look into is, do we know we don't have Techeles? When was the last time we had Techeles? When was the last time we knew we didn't have Techeles? So, the first thing we have to do is look at the Rambam. The Rambam in his commentary to the Parshas Mishnayos. Now, the Rambam lived primarily in the 12th century, beginning of the 13th century. And the Rambam writes in the Parshas Mishnayos, Menachos, the beginning of Parak Dalet, says the Rambam, Ve'enoi nimtza biyadenu hayoim. We do not have Techeles. Why? Lefi she'ein anu yodim l'tzayvai. We don't know how to diet. Well, what do you mean? It's not so complicated. Just take out the dye. No. Not every blue color is called Techeles. She'ein kol min Techeles b'tzemer nikra Techeles. Ella Techeles yadua. It has to be the specific known Techeles. She'i efshur la'asoisa hayoim. That it is impossible to create today. Yeah? Says the Rambam, it is impossible to make Techeles today. That is why we only use the white strings. The Rambam is writing very clearly, 800 years ago, we are no longer able to make Techeles. And by the way, the Shulchan Aruch codifies the halacha that we are no longer able to make Techeles. The Shulchan Aruch writes, Arachaim Siman Test. The halacha is that, we know, if you have cotton strings only work on a cotton garment. If you have silk strings, they only work on a silk garment. But wool or linen can exempt any garment. So it says the Shulchan Aruch, even though linen could exempt any garment, you cannot put linen strings on a wool garment. Why? It's shatnez. But what do you mean? You're allowed to have shatnez and tzitzis. That's only if you have real tzitzis with Techeles. But nowadays you don't have real tzitzis, therefore you cannot put linen on wool. Says the Shulchan Aruch, the leka Techeles. Bizman hazeh leka Techeles. Nowadays we don't have Techeles. Now, presumably the Shulchan Aruch is not just reporting the reality of the situation. If the Shulchan Aruch codifies that we don't have Techeles, that means halachically we cannot have acceptable Techeles. That would be the simple presumption of Shulchan Aruch. He's not telling me factual information. That's not the purpose of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan is saying that it's not possible to have Techeles. In fact, the Medrash says on this week's Parsha that Techeles has been hidden for all time. The Medrash writes conclusively, look at number 6, Eimosai kishu Techeles v'achshav ein lanu ela lava. Nowadays we only have white. Shehat-Techeles nignaz. Because Techeles has been hidden away. Right? Techeles has been hidden. So here we have a very clear Medrash. Now when the Medrash says nignaz, also presumably that means not that we just don't know where it is. Nignaz means it was intentionally, deliberately hidden for all time. Like the Aron was nignaz. You ever hear any Talmidei Chachamim searching for the Aron? Right? The only person who looks for the Aron is, you know who, right? Thank you. Exactly. But I never heard of the Vilna Gaon searching for the Aron. The Aron was Nignaz. The Mata of Moshe was Nignaz. But no, there was never an expedition of Talmidei Chachamim looking for the Aron. So presumably, just like the Aron was Nignaz, the Techeles was Nignaz. Says the Vilna Gaon. Then when the Shulchan Aruch says we don't have Techeles today, he's not just commenting on the reality of the situation. He's based on the Medrash that says that the Techeles was Nignaz. So it would seem, as we begin our expedition, this is going to be an expedition in futility. Because the Rambam says it's impossible to make Techeles. Shulchan Aruch paskins, we don't have Techeles. The Medrash says Techeles was Nignaz. Comes the Arizal, and the Arizal says, Al Pi Kabbalah, we cannot make Techeles. The Arizal says in the Pri Etz Chaim that Shebizman Hazeh Achar HaChorban, after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Ein Banu Koyach Lahatil Techeles. We don't have the spiritual firepower to be able to handle Techeles. And in fact, Rabbi Isai, the Arizal writes in the Shar HaKavanos, the exact same thing. That Techeles was only available and usable when the Beis Hamikdash stood, but nowadays we no longer have the spiritual capacity to be able to wear Techeles. That's what the Ben Ish Chai writes in a tshuva, that the Techeles would be so spiritually powerful for us that it would overwhelm us, overcome us. We wouldn't be able to handle it. We wouldn't be able to be masig it. And therefore, again, it would seem that looking for Techeles would be an expedition in futility, an exercise in futility. The Rambam says it's impossible to make. The Medrash says it's Nignaz. The Arizal says Al Pi Kabbalah. There's a certain hashgacha in it that we don't have Techeles. So why look for it? Why look for something that Arizal says we can't have? And more Rabbi say even further, there's a very frightening Safri. The Safri, of course, is the commentary of the Tarsha Bal Peh on Devarim. Amar Rabbi Yossi, look at number 11. Pamachas hayisi mahalach miksiv letzor. I was once going on the road. Umatzasi zakein echad. I found an old man b'sha'altiv b'shalom, and I asked him how he's doing. And I asked him, "Nu, what do you do for a living? You're an accountant, right? This is Rabbi Yossi wants to know. What do you do for a living? You're a doctor. What do you do?" He says, "I make my living from the chilazon." So Rabbi Yossi says, "Chilazon? Chilazon's not available anywhere." He said, Yeah. I swear," he says, "there's a place in the Yam." There's a girsa change. Makoim b'Yam. There's an underground mountainous area. It sounds like, the Galapagos Islands. There's an underwater mountainous area that is protected by poisonous spiders. And anyone who tries to get the Techeles from this underground mountainous area will be murdered by poisonous spiders, who, by the way, also kill the chilazon, who die there, and that's where you could find the chilazon. So Rabbi Yossi hears this. He heard enough already about what this guy does for a living. And he says, it appears to me that the chilazon has been hidden away for the tzaddikim la'asad lama. So this would seem to be the strongest indication that it is absolutely impossible to find the Techeles. Because I don't know about you. You want to go snorkeling, I'm in. But I'm not going to these underground mountains with poisonous snakes, right? Or poisonous spiders. I don't do that, okay? So it seems like from the Safri that Rabbi Yossi is saying that it would be absolutely impossible to find the chilazon today. When was the last time in history we had the chilazon? Now, if you would take the words of the Arizal literally, the Arizal says that from the time the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we don't have the chilazon anymore. But that's certainly not the case, because you find many Gemaras and Shas that not only did all the Tanoim have Techeles, the Amoraim definitely had Techeles. You look in the Gemara Menachos Mem Gimel number 12. Mar mi mishchi aisi techelta b'shnei Rabbi Achai. Mar brought Techeles in the years of Rabbi Achai. Rabbi Achai lived in the 5th century. Rabbi Achai lived in the 5th century. That means they had Techeles in the 5th century. Look in the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The Gemara talks about a message, a cryptic message that was sent to Rava. and they told Rava about a pair of Talmidei Chachamim that managed to smuggle out of Luz Techeles. Now, why was it so dangerous for them to smuggle Techeles out of Luz? So this is very important to understand. Historically, the Romans made a decree that you cannot dye any garment with Techeles. Why? Because the royal garments, the Roman royal garments were all made out of Techeles, and the Romans made a decree that whoever uses Techeles to dye any garment was jeopardizing their life. So it is very, very, very likely that it was during this period of time that we lost Techeles. Why? Because of the decrees of the Romans, and in fact Ben Yehoyada learns that this Gemara that talks about the danger of using Techeles is based on the decree of the Romans who outlawed Techeles. So what we're learning is, and Rabbi Glatstein writes this as well, that Techeles definitely existed in the time of the Tanoim. It definitely existed in times of the early Amoram, and somewhere in the 5th century, 1,500 years ago, why exactly we don't know, Techeles was lost. And according to the Medrash, it wasn't just lost, it was nignaz forever. So again, you have the Rambam that says, impossible to make. You have the Shulchan Aruch that says, halachically we don't have it. You have the Arizal that says, we can't have it. You have the Safri that says, it is hidden for the tzaddikim la'asalavai. And more than that, it may be alluded to in the psukim themselves that we no longer have Techeles. Say, in the psukim themselves? Well, first of all, the Gemara in Shabbos says, on the pasuk in Koheles, B'choles yiu bigadecha levanim. Your garment should always be white. Says the Gemara, this refers to tzitzis. Ask the Marsha. Tzitzis aren't always white. Sometimes they're also blue. No. It says b'chol. Always, for all of history. For all of history, only the white exists. But historically, a time will come that we won't have the Techeles. So when the Gemara says, your begadim should always be white, it's commenting on the fact that tzitzis will always be white, but they won't always be blue. That's what the Marshal learns. And then we have, Rabbi Sai, 3 Nevi'im, Misnabim, B'Signon Echad. You have 3 great luminaries, all make the same comment. If you look back at the pasuk in this week's Parsha, take a look back at number 1. V'yasu lahem tzitzis al kanfei v'gdeihem l'doiraisam v'nasenu al tzitzis hakanaf pesil Techeles. Why does the word l'doiraisam appear in the middle of the pasuk? It should be at the end of the pasuk. L'doiraisam should go back and explain the entire mitzvah of tzitzis. Says the Alshich, says Arachayim HaKadosh, says the Chasam Sofer. The pasuk is very meduyak. It's v'yasu lahem tzitzis al kanfei v'gdeihem l'doiraisam. The mitzvah of tzitzis will last for all time. But v'nasnu al tzitzis hakanaf p'sil Techeles. But the mitzvah of Techeles will not be l'doiraisam. That mitzvah will end at some time. So not only, Rabbi Sai, do we have the Medrash that says that tzitzis was nignaz, the Techeles was nignaz, and the Rambam who says we can't have it, and the Shulchan Aruch who says we don't have it, and the Arizal who says we're not allowed to have it, and the Safri that says it's hidden by poisonous spiders, and the pasuk in Koheles that says only levanim is b'choles. The pasuk in this week's Parsha seems to indicate that we will not have Techeles throughout history. And therefore, to go search for Techeles would seem, at first glance, to be a waste of time. But you should know that every single argument we have given so far has absolutely nothing to do with the halachic process. Why? The Medrash says that Techeles was hidden. We do not paskin halacha from a Medrash. Every Jew has to know. Yeah, but the Medrash says, good, you have to know how to understand the Medrash. Never in Shulchan Aruch did Maran Bet Yosef or the Ramah say, oh, we do this because it's a Medrash, or we don't do this because it's a Medrash. Halacha follows the Rishonim and the Shas, not Midrashim. So the fact that a Medrash says that the Techeles was nignaz, wonderful. But if God told you got to wear Techeles and you could find it, so go find it. And even more than that, the Eitz Yosef writes on the Medrash that the word nignaz does not mean what it means in Kol HaTorah Kula. In this instance, the Eitz Yosef writes in number 22, nignaz means nishtakach. It was forgotten. It was forgotten. So it was forgotten. Fine, it was forgotten. But if you could remember it and remind yourself, then we'd be obligated to do that. So you can't bring a proof from the Medrash that Techeles cannot be restored. But you'll say, but the Arizal says that we can't spiritually handle Techeles. Do you know how to read an Arizal? You know their klalim and how to read an Arizal? Not everything the Arizal says that you don't do, you're not allowed to do. You have to know when he'll say something and you have to abide, and when you don't have to abide. So you say, how can you say such a thing? Rav Yaakov Hillel wrote a volume called Shalos Teshuvos Vayoshav Hayam. Vayoshav Hayam. Where in his last tshuva, he addresses the following shaila. Are you allowed to marry a woman older than you? Nowadays, they made it like a mitzvah, you have to, right? Everybody, to cure the Shelach crisis. But the question Rav Yaakov Hillel is dealing with, it's mashma in the Arizal, that you should not marry a woman older than you. And the question is, are you allowed to? To which Rav Yaakov Hillel answers that if the Arizal says not to do something, and there's no source in Chazal, you are not bound by it. Unless he says, I paskin halacha l'maisa, you're not allowed to do it. But if the Arizal just comments that you shouldn't do it, there is no inyan at all not to do it. Because many of the things he says are just a mashal in the Kabbalistic realm, and many people get themselves in major trouble because they have no clue how to read Arizal. Says Rabbi Yaakov Hillel, here's the rule. If the Arizal makes a statement without saying, I paskin this way, if there's no source in Shas and Poskim, no one is obligated to follow. And not only that, you shouldn't follow it. Besides that, says the Arizal, many Gedolim throughout the centuries married women older than them. And they had very good lives, and they had very nice families, and nobody said boo. So now, because the Arizal implies you can't, we don't make up new halachas from the Arizal. If the Arizal says, I paskin, you're not allowed to do it, and it's based on Chazal, even then, you're not obligated to follow. It's Divrei Kabbalah, you're not obligated. If you want to go, let's name a Shur Sadin, and you're on the level, you should follow it. Why? He says the Arizal was not saying you can't marry someone older than you. He is looking at the reality of the situation, that most people marry people younger than them, and taking that reality, he's commenting on a Kabbalistic reason for that. But if somebody wants to marry someone older than them, gesund hate, right? Send me an invitation, no problem. And by the same token, many suggest, the fact that the Arizal says you can't have Techeles today, he's not paskening, you're not allowed to have Techeles. Nowhere does Arizal say, Hayresi, l'cholam v'eda, sha'osr l'bosh Techeles. He doesn't say that. He's commenting on the fact, the reality is we don't have it, and he's explaining a Kabbalistic rationale. If you find it, you gotta wear it. So you're not going to paskin on just because the Arizal says we don't have it, that's not a reason not to look for it. By the way, I came across an amazing tshuva from the Satmar Rebbe. This is really an ingenious thought, an amazing thought, based on Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. He quotes the Yaris Tavash. I said it over this morning to somebody. The guy said, did you ever see the Satmar Rebbe? I said, not recently, no. Right? He said, when he was 15 years old, like 60 years ago, somebody snuck him into the Satmar Beis Medrash on Simchas Torah, and he saw the face of the Satmar Rebbe. He said it was the only time in his life he saw the Shechina. That's what he told me. This is what somebody told me today. In any event, listen to what he says. Techeles is produced from a non-kosher aquatic creature. There's a rule in halacha. You're only allowed to use a dvar mitzvah if it's made from something that you're allowed to eat. For example, tefillin. It says, "Alman tia teres Hashem beficha." We darshan min mutter beficha. You can only make it from an animal that it's mutter to eat. So there's a rule that a dvar mitzvah has to come from something that you're allowed to eat. So how could you make techeles from chilazon? Chilazon is a treifa aquatic creature. Says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz, on a different note, on God's Kisei HaKavod, you ever notice the fact that there's some interesting creatures on God's throne of glory? What's on God's throne of glory? You have an eagle, you have a lion. They're not kosher. The lions are not kosher. Not even the ones in Detroit. No lions are kosher. The eagles are not kosher either. What? Okay, you're hopping on the job. Very good, right? So that's lahavin davar mitashava, right? So they're not. So what they doing on the Kisei HaKavod? What are they doing on the Kisei HaKavod? Says Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz. On God's Kisei HaKavod, there's no problem, because to God, He sees the whole world as one. He glances at everything as one. It's Hakol B'skira Achas. So Mali, it's on His Kisei HaKavod, or it's on the ocean floor. So that's why you could have non-kosher animals on God's throne of glory. But a Jew, when he's performing mitzvahs, cannot perform a mitzvah with something that is what? Treif. Says the Satmar Rebbe. But the mitzvah of Techeles is different. Why? Because what's the purpose of Techeles? Techeles looks like the sea. The sea looks like the heavens. The heavens looks like the Kisei HaKavod. So the purpose of Techeles is to imagine yourself standing before the Kisei HaKavod. But the Kisei HaKavod, you're allowed to have a davar tameh. That's why the Techeles is the only dvar mitzvah that you're allowed to have a dvar tameh. That's the svara of the Samra. Very interesting. Very creative and genius svara. And therefore he says, the Arizal says there's a Kabbalistic reason why we don't have Techeles today. Says the Satmar Rebbe, there's more than a Kabbalistic reason. There's a revealed reason. The purpose of Techeles is to remind you of the sea. The sea reminds you of the heavens. You know what the Gemara says in Brachas and Daf Nun Tes? Miyam shechar Beis Hamikdash, the sky is never blue anymore. The sky is never perfectly blue. So if the sky is never perfectly blue, what's the purpose of wearing Techeles to remind you of the sea? The sea is not going to remind you of the sky. You have no idea what the sky looks like anymore. So therefore, if the sky is not blue, therefore it is only reasonable that the whole Techeles is obsolete. It cannot serve its function. The whole function of Techeles is to remind you of the color of the sky. But we don't have the Tayar Harakia, says the Gemara in Brachas. And even more than that, if the purpose of Techeles, he says, is to remind you of the connection between heaven and earth, where was the main location on earth that connected Shamayim va'aretz? V'zeh sharash around the Beis HaMikdash. If you don't have a Beis HaMikdash, you don't need Techeles. Techeles is obsolete. And therefore, says the Satmar Rebbe, there's not just a Kabbalistic reason why we don't have Techeles. There's a very logical, reasonable reason, practical reason. The purpose of Techeles is to remind you of the connection of Shamayim va'aretz. That was created through the Beis HaMikdash. We don't have a Beis HaMikdash. We don't have the Tayar Harakia. And therefore, he writes, we no longer have Techeles. He's explaining, the Arizal is saying Kabbalistically, he's saying a practical svara. The Safri wrote about Techeles that's in the Galapagos Islands, protected by, sea monsters who are going to eat you up and bite you and kill you. The Maskil of David Pardo wrote a commentary on the Safri where he writes openly, you have to know how to read the Safri. What the Safri is saying is that there are two kinds of Techeles. One guarded by dangerous sea monsters that you can't get, and there is Techeles that's still available. So while when we started the Shiur, we seem to think that Radziner Rebbe is pursuing an exercise in futility because we brought all these sources that we're not going to find it, these are not halachic reasons. Midrashim do not sway a person halachically. The Medrash says it was nignaz. If you're going to find it, then you'll have to deal with the Medrash. The Arizal says we don't have it. By the way, now this is, I don't know if I should say this, one of the more ironic things I've seen. Says the Satmar Rebbe, why were the Jews so happy when they saw Mordechai wearing the Techeles? It says, right? It says, Shoshanas Yaakov Tzahala v'Samecha. Yeah? Listen to this. B'roisam Yachad Techeles Mordechai. Until this period of time, the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed. That means they didn't have Techeles. When they saw Mordechai wearing the Techeles, that gave them the hope that the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt. And it must be that this is Aschalta de Geulta, says the Satmar Rebbe. Now, I don't think he was going that way. Right? But he says, Techeles are the first signs of the coming of Mashiach. And that's why the Jews were so happy when they saw Mordechai wearing the Techeles. Because again, like the Arizal says, that somehow there's a link between the wearing of Techeles and the Binyan Beis HaMikdash. And then finally, bottom line is, what do the Poskim say? Do they say Techeles is gone forever? Or do they say maybe Techeles can be brought back? That's the bottom line. If you want to know, should we look for Techeles? Don't look in Midrashim. Don't look in the Kisvei Ari. You have to look in the Poskim. And the Poskim write explicitly, Techeles can be found. You say, really? The Poskim say that? Well, first we have a Shas Teshuvas Radvaz in Chelek Beis, Siman Taf Reish Pei Hey. Says the Radvaz, 2 lines from the bottom of the page. Ve'efsher she'ad hayoim hu matzoi. It is very possible that we have Techeles. Ela she'en makirin oisai. But you wouldn't know if it stared you in the face. You could go to the aquarium with your kids, and you could be pressing up your nose, staring at this octopus, and not even realizing that this is the chilazon. Or he says, so says the Radbaz, it is very possible that we do have Techeles. So, okay, the Radbaz is very early. We don't always paskin like the Radbaz. If you ever learned Hilchos Tzitzis in the Mishnah Berurah, you would know that there's one posek that the Mishnah Berurah quotes on every single page. And that's the Malbim and the Artzos HaChayim. Says the Malbim, isn't it a very strange halacha? The halacha is you're not allowed to put, Bisman Hazeh, you're not allowed to make linen tzitzis. You know why? Because the Shulchan Aruch says we're afraid you might put Techeles on it. So what? You're allowed to have Techeles on a linen garment. And you'll wear it at night, and at night, we don't say Aseh Decheles Aseh. In fact, the Malbim, why should we worry you're going to put Techeles on a beggar of Pisha? We don't have Techeles. Says the Malbim, because we hold like the Radvaz, that you can have Techeles today. If you find it, you can have it. You can restore it. So it's not gone forever. The Radvaz says you could bring it back. The Malbim says you could bring it back. The Shas Teshuvas Maharil also writes that all the Gezeros of Chazal, there are many things that we're not allowed to do because we're worried maybe you can put Techeles on a garment. Says the Malbim, says the Maharil, these decrees still apply today because it's possible to find Techeles. And therefore, bottom line is, we're giving the Radziner Rebbe the green light. We're saying the Medrash, you don't have to worry about the Medrash, you don't have to worry about the Kisvei Ari. The Poskim say you could find it, so he's off. And we're after him. We're following him now to the deep seas to try to find the long-lost Chilazon. Because imagine if we would find it, imagine how elevated we would be, imagine what a great spiritual aliyah we would have. And therefore in the year 1888, while in 1887 he wasn't able to get his hands on a living Chilazon, in the year 1888, a year after he published his first Sefer, he got dozens and hundreds of letters from Gedolim around the world. However, he said like this, I was not successful in finding this Chilazon. So number 29, the second paragraph. Since the last time I published my first work, Sefune Tmunei Chol, I did not get my hands on the living Chilazon. I have set out to sail the 7 seas. Orchos Yamim Ubanu L'Gvol Yam HaTichon. I have reached the Mediterranean Sea. B'Medinas Italia. Can you imagine a Yid, a Rebbe from Poland, has made it to Italy, Be'ir Napoli, and he has come to the great aquarium in Naples that opened up in the 1870s, and he writes about this amazing aquarium. You can look it up, you can read about it, it's still open today, which is built on the seacoast with glass walls, so you could basically go into the sea and see the animals in their natural habitat. And you could actually see the cuttlefish staring you in the face. It's an awesome sight. No. So, says the Radziner Rebbe, I made it to Italy, and let me explain in great detail, and he goes on to explain in the greatest detail the scale, the fins of the cuttlefish, and the tentacles, and how they catch their prey. And he says, it's no wonder then that this animal has always, since time immemorial, has captured the imagination of all the naturalists. Because says the Radziner Rebbe, and you'll see why he probably might not have been a Rebbe today. He says if you read through Aristotle was fascinated with the chilazon, the cuttlefish. And he has all kinds of diagrams about what this tint fish looks like. And not only that, but a fellow contemporary of mine, he writes, in Britain, who traveled all over the world, also is very fascinated with this fish. His name is Darwin. Can you imagine? The Radziner Rebbe is citing Darwin in terms of the fascination with the cuttlefish. By the way, today, it's discovered this is considered perhaps the most intelligent creature on the planet. The cuttlefish. It's like all brains. You know, I don't know how much seichel it has. You know, a lot of people have a lot of brain, but I don't know how much common sense it has.
Any
but
pictures around for that?
what? Yeah, there are pictures. There's more than pictures. I'll tell you later. There's a lot about, and therefore says the Radziner Rebbe, read Aristotle, read Darwin's works about his travels. The cuttlefish is well known, and therefore I have it. I got my fish, and now I'm going to bring it back to Poland, and I'm going to be making Techeles for all my Hasidim. 1888. Now, by the way, he's just bothered with a slight problem, and that is that a Dvar Mitzvah cannot be made out of something that you can't eat. It says, Laman tia Toras Hashem beficha. Says Radziner Rebbe, don't worry, the Chassam Sofer already addressed this problem in the Tshuvas Chassam Sofer Yerodea, Siman Reish Ayin Vav. The Chassam Sofer never dreamt he would find the chilazon. But the Chassam Sofer writes, how could we use the chilazon for tzitzis? It's asur, you can't eat it. To which the Chassam Sofer says, you don't make tzitzis out of Techeles. Tzitzis, the Techeles only dyes. It's only the color. It's not the Chefza Shel Mitzvah. It only enhances the Chefza Shel Mitzvah. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, based on this, Chassam Sofer writes, if you want to paint your tefillin with the fat of a treif fish, mutter. He says, by the way, I don't do that. Chassam Sofer says, I use Shem and Zayizach. But if you want to, you have a raya from the chilazon that it's permitted. By the way, the Noid of Yehuda in Madura Tinyana, Siman Gimel also writes that you see from the chilazon that if you're allowed to use an animal that you can't eat as something exterior to the item of the mitzvah. The Radziner Rebbe was good friends with Rabbi Shiur Lakutna. And he was pressing him, Rebbe, please agree to this Techeles. So the tradition in my family is that my great-great-grandfather, Pesach Moshe Goldman, helped publish the Tshuvas of the Yeshuas Malkai. And when Rabbi Shiur Lakutna was finally pressed against the wall, he said, Radziner Rebbe, you're a great man, but what do you want from my life? The Olam didn't accept it. The Radziner Rebbe says, the Olam? He calls outside to the water carrier. Hey, water carrier! What's the halacha of chametz mishei shais ulamala? The water carrier says, Rebbe, you're asking me what the halacha of chametz is? Ask Rabbi Shiur Lakutna. I don't know. You want to know about Vaser? I'll tell you about Vaser. I don't know anything about chametz. Says the Radziner Rebbe to Rabbi Shiur Lakutna. But the Gemara says, Mishei shais ulamala, kule alma loy pligi. Everyone knows the halacha. This guy doesn't know the halacha. So you see from here, who's the olam? The olam are the gedolei hadar. They're the olam. Everybody else is not part of the olam. Rabbi Shiur Lakutna didn't go for it, and he said, "Look, you want to wear it, gesund to hate. My personal opinion," he writes in the Tshuvas, is that we will not have Techeles until Ad Ki Yaveh Shila, until Mashiach comes. But he writes very interestingly. He says you cannot be moicha against someone who wants to wear Techeles. You know why? Because we have no clear proof that it's not Techeles. He says maybe taka misnoitze tagula, maybe the gula is coming. But to say you have to wear it, we have no evidence at all. This is Techeles. And then Rabbi Shmuel Kutna advances a brilliant svara, an amazing thing. If you don't have Techeles, do you still get a mitzvah of tzitzis? Yes or no? Yes. Not necessarily. There's a machlokes tanon. The Mishnah says in Menachos on Daf Lamed Ches number 33, Hatcheles eina ma'akeves es halavan. The halavan eina ma'akeves es techeles. One mitzvah does not stop the other mitzvah. You could get one without the other. Fine. That is the opinion of the Chachamim. Says the Gemara, this Mishnah seems to be not like Rebbe. Because Rebbe holds, if you don't have Techeles, you might as well take off your garment. You don't get the mitzvah of tzitzis, because it says, or Isa Moisai, if you don't see the Techeles, you don't get any mitzvah at all. It's machlokes Rebbe and the Chachamim. Who do we paskin like? So we all know we paskin like the Chachamim. The Baal Amor says no. The Baal Amor says that normally the klal is, we always paskin like Rebbe when he argues on one person. And the Gemara says in Menachos, Man Chachamim, Rabbi Yitzchak. So it's Rebbe against one Tana. Says the Baal Amor, Halacha Lamaisa, we don't have tzitzis anymore. You hear this? Baal Amor holds no tzitzis b'zman hazeh midaraisa. However, the Rambam, the Rif, the Rosh, and all the Rishonim argue, and they say that Hatcheles eina ma'akeves es halavan, and that's how the Shulchan Aruch passes. Says Yeshua's Malkai, unbelievable svar. Says, you want to know why Techeles went lost? He says like this: in the early generations, there's a machlokes Rebbe and the Chachamim. People didn't know who we paskin like. People had to be chayshesh, had to be concerned for the opinion of Rebbe, that if you don't have Techeles, you don't have tzitzis. So you know what Jews did? By hook or by crook, they got their hands on Techeles. Either they swam to the Galapagos and they dealt with the poisonous spider and they fought the spider, or even though the Romans made a decree if you have Techeles they're going to kill you, the Jews were moiser nefesh for the mitzvah of Techeles, because after all the halacha might be like Rebbe. But once the halacha was paskin like the Rabbanon, that you could be mekayim tzitzis without Techeles, the Jews no longer were required to risk their lives to get Techeles, and therefore that's when Techeles began to go lost. And he brings many proofs from many halachas that until a halacha was paskind, it was unclear what the halacha was. For example, Chazal say that had Rus come a day earlier and asked, could she marry Boaz? They would have said no. Maya aviv v'lay maya avis. It was only determined a day later that she was mutter. That means Jewish practice was different before halacha was. So when the Shulchan Aruch paskin, when the Rambam paskin, like the Chachamim, fine. But until that time, we were chayshish for Rebbe, and we had to do everything in our ability to try to seek out Techeles. But says Rabbi Shmuel Kutna, my opinion is, we will not have Techeles until Mashiach comes. Says the Radziner Rebbe, but this is 1888. Taf Reish Mem Ches. Taf Reish Mem Ches could be unscrambled. Terachim. Ata, Takum, Terachim, Tziyah. Mashiach is coming. So we could have Techeles. And in 1888, the Radziner Rebbe got his hands on the squid. He took out the dye. But it wasn't going well. He wasn't able to get the right blue color that he wanted. He wasn't able to produce the amount that he wanted. But he was very happy about one thing. That this squid, this cuttlefish that he found, fits perfectly into the sheet of Tysus. Tysus, the Masechta Shabbos, and Daf Ayin Hey writes that the ink of the chilazain is mifkad pakad, in a separate compartment from its lifeblood. And sure enough, he opened up the squid, and the squid had in a separate gland the ink. Nothing, no connection to its lifeblood. Radziner Rebbe said, I hit it on the head. This fits into the sheet of Tysus. It fits all the criteria of Techeles. The year 1889, the Radziner Rebbe printed his third sefer. Now this man doesn't waste time. Most people take them 30 years to write a sefer. One 1887, the next 1888, the next 1889. And comes the first day of Hanukkah, 1889, number 38. After many experimentations and many investigations, I finally got the right heat on my flame, and I was able to produce the requisite amount of blue dye, and in a short amount of time, thousands of Jews began to wear Techeles. But I didn't have enough. I didn't realize how many squids you need to produce Techeles. I didn't see this coming. I didn't know what to do. So says the Radziner Rebbe, in the year 1890, I got a hold of many more squids, many more cuttlefish, and Baruch Hashem, this has become widespread. The Radziner Rebbe kept an exact record of how many people he sold Techeles to. And you have it here. He said more than 12,000 Jews bought Techeles off him. Now that's a big fortune. Imagine, today I think it goes for like 150 a pair. So that's over $1 million worth of Techeles. But he had to spend a lot of money traveling to the aquarium in Italy, right? He couldn't use, the cool culture pass, all those, teacher passes. It didn't work. He didn't have clergy. They charged him. And he sold 12,000 pairs. And he writes, not just in Poland, in Österreich, in Ungarn, in Friesen, in Lita, the Marsham, the Poisek Hadar, seems that secretly he wore the Techeles of the Radziner Rebbe. In fact, he wrote in his Tzava that he wanted to be buried in it. The Mitzvah Panovitcher, legend has it he wore the Techeles of the Radziner Rebbe. Comes the Aruch HaShulchan. Aruch HaShulchan says, I don't care what your records show about how many pairs you sold. The Aruch HaShulchan writes in number 39, 4 lines from the end, V'da, Shezeh Shonim Sfurais. It's been a number of years. She'echad Hispoyer Shematza Chilazon. That someone has promoted the fact that he found the Chilazon. Now, Aruch HaShulchan doesn't say he's wrong, but he writes, Behim Shechachar of Eza Anashim. Some people followed him. Ach lo hayaloi shaymei migdalei adar. But the Gedolim did not, for all intents and purposes, you'll have a story here, a story there. In mass, the Gedolim did not follow it. B'nizbatel hadavar ad kiyavoi goyel tzedek b'mherav yameinu amen. Says Aruch HaShulchan, in what may be a prediction, a prophecy, a guess, we will not have Techeles until Mashiach comes. By the way, they brought the Techeles to the Chafetz Chaim. Chafetz Chaim says, I have no koyach to get involved with this. And he would not be nichnas into the end. Would not be nichnas into the end. One of the most interesting confrontations and episodes with the Radziner Rebbe is when he met the Beis Halevi. And one of the arguments the Beis Halevi gave was the pasuk in this week's Parsha. And that is, the word L'Dorei Sam is only after the Mitzvah of Lavan, but not after the Mitzvah of Techeles, which the Beis Halevi suggested, in the name of the Vilna Gaon, means that Techeles will not exist for all time. Now, between me and you, that's not really a halachic argument. Again, you can't make diyukim in the pasuk to paskin a halacha. So therefore, where we're leaving off is what really happened between Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, what really happened between the Beis Halevi and the Radziner Rebbe. And more adventures with the Radziner Rebbe will continue, same time, next week at 8:30 Wednesday evening. And we should all be Zoicha to the Bias Gal Tzedek Meher Yameinu Amen.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.